Every kid, regardless of income, has the opportunity to get a college education, not leave school deeply in debt.
The Congressional Budget Office just said that President Biden's student loan forgiveness plan will cost the federal government, or is expected to, about $400 billion.
The average cost for an undergraduate degree in Germany is around $32,000, paid for nearly entirely by the state. In the US, some schools charge that much for just 1 year. And as an American, I find this astonishing. How can a country with over 80 million people entirely fund higher education and not go bankrupt? Where is that money coming from? And why can't we seem to offer free college education for everyone, everywhere in the United States? If you've been a longtime follower of our channel, it's no secret that I moved to Germany to get my doctorate degree. And in doing so, I joined around 6,800 US students who are currently attending college in Germany. But to be honest, even after completing all 3 of my degrees, I'm still paying down student loan debt from my degrees in the United States. Like 1 in every 5 Americans, I have student loans. And while there have always been talks in the fringe of free university tuition, it always feels like real reform moves at a glacial pace at the federal level. So in today's video, we're going to be doing a little bit of a thought experiment. I'm going to compare my 2 alma maters, Albert Ludwigs Universität, or the University of Freiburg, and the University of Missouri, or Mizzou. Both are public universities with a similar sized student body population, an excellent university healthcare hospital system, and both are highly ranked in the fields of business, medicine, and law. But I've also been a student at both. I've also been a graduate teaching assistant at both, so I can offer a little bit of firsthand experience here as well. But ultimately in this video, I want to answer one important question. Why is it that this university can afford to give their students free tuition, but this one can't? So, let's dive in. Tuition fees are a common method of co-financing university education in a variety of countries. And their importance in financing higher education has actually increased in recent times. In Germany, students had to pay tuition fees of around 120 to 150 German marks per semester until 1971, when they were abolished in response to the student movement of the 1960s. University studies were then free for more than 30 years, with only a low lump sum subscription fee being charged for administrative and other purposes. After a change in law, however, federal states were allowed to grant permission to universities to charge tuition fees. Subsequently, 7 of the 16 federal states reintroduced tuition fees of up to 500 euros per semester in 2007, with the aim of improving the quality of university teaching and study conditions. This introduction was accompanied by highly controversial discussions, student protesting, and after just a few years, the federal states re-abolished the fees, with the last state of Lower Saxony passing the resolution in 2013. Today, German undergraduate students who attend university, including the University of Freiburg, can expect to pay a small administrative fee or semester contribution of around 150 to 250 euros a semester, or 300 to 500 euros per year. The University of Freiburg will also charge a 650 euro fee for dual degree or full-time master's students, and I personally paid around 360 euros in fees per semester as an international doctoral student. But I really should stress that these are actually called fees and are not outright tuition. But even if they were, they are dramatically lower than what you would experience in the United States. But before I get too ahead of myself, let's go back to the 1970s, because those tuition fees in Germany of around 120 German marks, adjusted for inflation and converted to euros, would be equivalent to approximately 233 euros. In contrast, tuition in the States in 1970 was higher, at $358. And this is a great graph because it shows both the actual and adjusted for inflation price of tuition and fees at public universities in the United States over time. But that overtime cost of university tuition is actually pretty important because in the United States, where the average cost of tuition has risen dramatically, in Germany, it's actually gone down. In fact, college tuition has more than doubled in the past 30 years. Again, as you see from this graph, the average cost of college tuition for in-state undergraduates in the United States is $9,349. And this is not far off from the University of Missouri. For their 2022-23 current school year, a full-time in-state undergrad would expect to pay $12,396 per year in tuition. But also, unlike Germany, if you're not from that state, the state of Missouri, you will actually be expected to pay more in what they term out-of-state tuition. And this is very different from Germany. For example, we live in Baden-Württemberg, so if someday Jack wanted to attend university in Berlin or Bayern or any other German state, he wouldn't be charged extra simply because he lives in Baden-Württemberg. But that's a huge departure, again, from the way things work in the United States. At Mizzou, for example, you pay over double, $30,734 for just tuition per year. And a reminder for our EU audience, tuition doesn't cover books, dorms, meal plans, or additional course fees. That's extra. And again, that number has risen over time. I actually was an out-of-state student when I attended Mizzou because I was an Illinois resident. I was pretty lucky in that I actually qualified for an academic scholarship that basically wiped out the difference between in-state and out-of-state tuition. But that cost is really significant. So now that I've given just a little brief overview of the overall out-of-pocket costs for students, I think we should maybe take a step back and actually see where the universities get the money from to actually keep their doors open. Today, all higher education institutions in Germany receive a budget from the responsible ministry of the state in which they're located, based on annual or biennial negotiations. The basic budget is complemented by additional agreements between higher education institutions and the state concerning the intake of additional numbers of students and the money to compensate for the loss of income from tuition fees. There are also additional funding programs, some funded jointly by the state and the federal ministry, for supporting and promoting research in the competition for excellence. But of course, despite all of this, academic higher education institutions continue to feel a bit underfunded. The pressure on academic staff to attract external research funding has increased, as has competition for such grants. But still, compared to other countries in Europe and compared to the United States, German higher education institutions continue to be rather generously funded by the states. One source estimates that this contributes to about 80% of their overall budgetary needs. And there are also ample opportunities and considerable amounts of external research funding available. So rather than talk about this in generalities, again, this is a little bit of a thought experiment. So I think we should actually look at the specific budget for the University of Freiburg. Their published operating budget for 2020 was 365 million euros, and this excludes the medicine and the Universitätsklinikum. So to cover their expenses, they received nearly 207.8 million euros from what they term third-party funding. This includes funding from the Bundesland, the Deutsches Forschungsgemeinschaft, or the DFG, and the European Union. So just shy of 2/3 of the funding comes from generally national or international governmental sources. Also, I don't want people to get confused by the fact that they call this third-party funding. It just simply means that funding that doesn't come from primary or secondary sources, those being the fees generated from students or the funding that they get from the state of Baden-Württemberg. And if we actually want to see how much the state of Baden-Württemberg actually contributes to the University of Freiburg, to be honest, this was kind of difficult to find just by doing online research. But if we presume that this number of primary and secondary funding, again, the fees and the money given from the state of Baden-Württemberg, is the difference between those two numbers in the rectorate reporting, it's going to be around 157 million euros, or around 43%. But what I think is particularly important here is to note that the overwhelming majority of the funding that goes into the University of Freiburg comes from government, quasi-governmental, or economic sources like market investments. Plus, like public institutions in the United States, the University of Freiburg is required to report when they get funding from what they term other sources. So even if we take the liberty in saying that maybe those other sources are private donations from private people or private companies, it still only amounts to just shy of 12 million, just 3% of the overall budget. And that's very different from how public universities are funded in the United States. So without further delay, let's continue this little thought experiment by taking a look at the operating budget for the University of Missouri. The University of Missouri Curators, which is the administrative board that runs the university, recently announced approval of their 2023 budget for next year. And it's a whopping $3.9 billion with a B. That's over 10 times the budget for the University of Freiburg. Now, to be fair, this number includes the university medical system, which the Freiburg calculations left out. It also includes their smaller satellite campuses in St. Louis, Rolla, and Kansas City. Plus, this is 2023, whereas my numbers for the University of Freiburg were from 2020. So to keep this analysis as fair and comparable as possible, I'm going to go back 3 years and look at the University of Missouri's numbers from 2020. I'll also do my best whenever I can to separate out the costs. That's for the medical system. And I'll only be looking at the costs associated with the University of Missouri Columbia's flagship campus. So taking all of those parameters into consideration, the operating budget for 2020 at the University of Missouri at Columbia, which I'm gonna just reference as Mizzou from here on out, was $1.4691 billion. In other words, 4 times the budget of the University of Freiburg. Again, with a pretty similar student body population. And now, I know, I literally just said that I wasn't going to lump the university medical system into these calculations, but especially at Mizzou, it's important to note that funding in one area of the system, it doesn't just stay in that one area, but it's spread throughout the University of Missouri systems. So for just a brief moment, I think we should at least talk about the amount of money brought in from the Mizzou healthcare system. It's actually pretty important that I show you this pie chart. The most major source of revenue across the entire University of Missouri system is what is termed auxiliary and patient service revenues. In other words, how much money the university makes from offering services to the public, the bulk of which is healthcare and medical services. And you know, if you haven't watched our video before on the differences between American and German healthcare, I'll go ahead and put a link up at the top of this video if you want to go ahead and check it out. But really, this example of the University of Missouri is such a wonderful illustration of just how financially lucrative healthcare really is in the United States. And it's not just big pharma who profits. To be quite honest, the University of Missouri couldn't keep its doors open based off of its current operating budget if it didn't have the income from the treatment of healthcare patients. But you know, enough about the hospital, let's get back to the general budget. Tuition and fees at Mizzou brought in $266.8 million. State appropriations from the state of Missouri brought in $217.8 million. Grants and contracts totaled $241 million, and other notable items such as gifts, which are donations from private individuals or companies, and the endowment, which are inherited gifts, totaled just shy of $95 million. How much money the university gets from the federal government is actually a little bit more difficult to calculate since it comes from various entities. But Mizzou specifically received $20.4 million from federal Pell Grants and $16.9 million in federal appropriations. And while that might sound like a lot of money when you're just looking at the numbers, in reality it only accounts for about 2.5% of their total budget. But nonetheless, this is actually incredibly important because if we go back to the question I asked at the very beginning of this video, why can't the United States afford free college tuition at all public universities? It's because of this gigantic difference in what the state and federal government currently pays and what they would have to pay in order to cover just the difference in tuition. In fact, they would need to double their current investment and then some, again, just to cover tuition, not including all of the other ways that the university makes money. This isn't exactly news to me. I mean, we've known for a long time now that American universities have been on a track of becoming more and more business-like in how they run their daily operations. They don't pay professors on a government-approved salary schedule like they do here in Germany. And the programs which bring in the most money in terms of gifts, grants, students, and publicity get the most money in terms of budget. And I'm going to give you just a small example of this. One of the courses that I taught was an AutoCAD class. Now, in a computer lab setting, I can teach around 15 to 20 students. And that's mostly just because I can't troubleshoot problems in real time with every student, as well as teaching them new skills if the class gets much larger than that. Now, a business professor, on the other hand, who maybe let's just say is teaching a lecture on the fundamentals of finance and accounting, they might be able to lecture over 100 students. So from the university's perspective, if we assume that they pay us the same, which they don't, but even if they did, which professor is giving the university a greater return on investment? It's not me. And that's in part why many major universities in the US have dropped majors that don't return a profit. And they're typically those in the social sciences and humanities, including English, philosophy, and political science. And please, don't get me wrong. I do think that it is the university's job to provide students with practical knowledge and to give them the skill set that they need in order to be competitive in a modern workforce. Absolutely. But I also think that it's the job of a public research university to also give students theoretical knowledge and the ability to think critically in order to be adaptable in that competitive workforce. Today, the most prestigious universities in the West are still those that are defined by their humanities legacy. And without them, they would be essentially technical institutes. And in the meantime, across the United States, state governments are disinvesting in public higher education. And that means that universities are relying more and more on gift giving to fill the gap and trimming the fat when they have programs that aren't bringing in money. But to be honest, it really can't be understated how important gift giving specifically has become for major universities. In a little anecdotal note, the ink hadn't even dried on my diploma, and I hadn't even made my first student loan payment before I received a call from the University Alumni Association asking if I would give a donation to the university.
All right, cool. $50 million, no problem. 20 million in 20s and 10 million in 10s. You want any fives with that?
I'm still trying to pay you. Anyway, but it happens all the time. And while I think there could be an entire video alone made on just the impact that giving and donations has on American universities, it is important to point this out because I think in the context of budgeting and spending, it really just goes to illustrate that in the US, public universities, although they are public education, they are very different animals than K through 12 education. I mean, we would never dream of shutting down an elementary school because they didn't turn a profit. Elementary schools aren't meant to turn a profit. They're meant to provide a public service via the education of the youth. And although many public high schools in the States do have boosters, which are typically private individuals and companies who give donations to things like sports clubs, I don't think we would ever imagine our children walking to chemistry class down a hallway sponsored by Monsanto. But that's totally the reality at Mizzou when you visit the Bond Life Sciences Center with the Monsanto Auditorium and the Monsanto Lobby. And here's the thing, despite nearly 60% of all jobs in the US economy requiring higher education, and the fact that the wage gap between people who have a bachelor's degree and people with only a high school education has nearly doubled since the 1980s, Americans, quite frankly, don't tend to see universities, technical colleges, or even community colleges as an extension of public education. And while 31 states do offer some form of free community college, Eligibility considerations, including residency, income, age, and even your field of study, apply. Seriously, depending on your major, it might not actually even be free. And no shade to community colleges, but it's important to point out that not all of their programs are actually accredited. And it's only free for the first 2 years. So you can't actually complete a bachelor's degree there for free. So in the end, when we ask the question of how can Germany afford free university tuition for everybody, I think most Germans would turn around and say, how can you afford not to? Okay, so if you've made it this far into the video with me, it's important that I give you a few baseline statistics just to provide some context here, because I can imagine that if you're an American watching this video, your knee-jerk reaction to what I've told you so far is to say, free college tuition isn't free. The money has to come from somewhere. And you're right, it does have to come from somewhere. Europe also traditionally has higher taxes than the United States, which allows those countries to offer additional social services such as university healthcare, better public transportation, and free college tuition. The OECD released its 2021 report on the tax burden on earnings among member countries. And their report ranks the countries by their tax wedge percentage. And this is the dollar measure of the income tax rate. The countries below in the red arrows offer free college, with the exception of the United States. There are also other European countries that offer free college, but the countries that I'm highlighting below are the most well-known examples. And while I should say, the tax wedge is not solely driven by free college tuition costs, the countries that offer this benefit do have a much higher income tax rate than the United States. So if in the United States we are going to go the route of financing free college tuition, I mean, yes, we would actually have to raise our current income tax rate. But exactly how much is difficult to calculate because, again, this difference in tax rate includes a lot of other benefits that Americans already just pay for out of pocket. But European countries also differ substantively from the United States in terms of the percentage of college attendees that their debt-free models serve. The World Bank reports tertiary school enrollment. This is going to include universities, colleges, technical training institutes, community college, nursing schools, and research laboratories. In 2019, the tertiary enrollment for European countries that offer debt-free college in the United States are these figures that you see on your screen. The percentage is calculated by taking the tertiary enrollment as a percentage of the total population of students who graduated within the last 5 years. For all countries, with the exception of Finland, the US has a much higher percentage of students who have enrolled in post-high school education. So it's likely that this will add a level of complexity to debt-free college plans in the United States. But there's one final statistic that I do want to point out, because despite having massively higher budgets, it doesn't necessarily buy you a better education. Taking out private universities, because they really are an entirely different animal, the United States has 19 public universities that make up the global top 100, which is really outstanding. But equally as impressive, I think, is Germany, a country 28 times smaller, about the size of Texas, with a quarter of the population. They have 6 public universities in the top 100. So adjusted for population, we're actually pretty on par with one another. On the next episode of the Black Forest family, you probably guessed it if you made it this far into the video, but we're kicking off a mini-series on university life. Last week on the community tab here on YouTube, I asked you a question. How did you pay for university? And guys, we got over 1,000 responses. So given that we talked today about how much it costs to attend university in the US versus Germany, next week we're gonna take a deep dive into just how different the cultures are in how students are expected to pay for it. From crippling student loan debt to financial aid from families, we'll be taking a deep dive into the full cost of that education, including housing, books, and tuition. So if you haven't done so already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell to be alerted when that next video goes live. And if you enjoyed what you saw today, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. Tschüss!